Okay, welcome to the fourth episode of Transformation. Here with us, we have Dr. Carol Lee, Senior Researcher on the Developer Success Lab and a clinical psychologist. If this is your first time joining us, Transformation is a multi-episode miniseries for engineering leaders undergoing transformation, which is pretty much all of us. We've had an incredible time interviewing leaders like David Farah, Kat Hicks, and Charlie Mode. If you haven't seen their episodes yet, I highly encourage you to go back and watch those because we'll be building off of those for our conversation today with Carol. One of the big themes last time with Charlie, Director of Engineering at SalesLoft, was the art of rolling out flow in a culturally positive way. Today, we're going to go and talk a little bit more about what that means with Carol. As a senior research scientist at Developer Success Lab at Pluralsight Flow, Carol Lee leverages her expertise in mental health and thoughtful measurement to study how developers cope and thrive through stressful circumstances. Carol has over a decade of experience leading academic and industry research in clinical health, measurement, and human behavior. Carol serves as a research fellow at the Integrated Behavioral Health Research Institute and as a clinical science advisor for Bravely Mental Health. She holds a PhD in clinical psychology from UMass Boston. We're so excited to have you here once again. Welcome, Carol.
Thanks for having me, Austin. Hi.
Okay, so let's set some context. You are a clinical psychologist, but you work for a lab that is funded by a technology company. What is that all about?
Yes. Yes, I am a clinical psychologist. What that really means is that I'm formally trained to both give therapy and conduct research, but I've always just kind of been more focused on the research side. My expertise is in stress and anxiety, which developers, I'm sure, can really relate to. But specifically looking at what factors kind of mitigate stress and anxiety, as well as what factors kind of maintain or exacerbate it, right? I actually first dipped my toes into tech when I was asked to consult on some research kind of looking at these factors of anxiety in mental health tech. And it's kind of interesting. This kind of just got me thinking about, okay, well, who are the people building the tech, right? Who are these people behind this mental health tech? And so obviously, like a very good researcher, I started looking into who these people are, which kind of led to a few realizations. So first and foremost, it's this idea that, hey, the world that we know it, including our healthcare systems, actually run on code, which I know everybody watching this right now is like, yeah, Carol, we know. But, as a psychologist, that just wasn't something I'd really thought about. So that was kind of an interesting moment for me personally. The second thing is that, the people writing this code are often under a ton of pressure. They're also really misunderstood, which, just so you know, maintains and exacerbates high rates of stress, anxiety, depression, etc. And then finally, it was this note that there is almost no research on how to mitigate developers' stress and anxiety. So even though we rely on folks' work on a daily basis, our healthcare systems rely on developers on a daily basis, we do not study how to make sure that these developers are doing well. And so for me, it's really a matter of using my own expertise in clinical psychology to really generate evidence on how to support folks supporting us every day.
Which is, perfect intro for this because it's exactly what we're going to be talking about. If you could give us maybe a sneak peek behind the curtain a little bit about what do you do on the Developer Success Lab?
Yeah, so I lead the quantitative arm of our research. But more specifically, I integrate my research in things like clinical theory, clinical frameworks, methods, assessment measures, interventions, right? All of that to conduct original research on software developers with the aim of doing two major things. First, I really want to create awareness on what software developers are experiencing. And then second, I want to generate evidence on how we can actually help software developers in an evidence-based way.
So, which is leads us right into what we're going to be talking about. And I love this idea of evidence-based, methods in terms of we're not just coming up with this in the back, back of our mind. This is actually things you're researching and studying and proving, which is amazing. So we had Kat, also in the Developer Success Lab, with us on Transformation a month ago, and she showed us this chart. And so I want to kind of bring that back up because it's a very kind of good kind of starting point for what we're going to be talking about. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on for those who haven't seen this yet on this chart?
Yeah, so this is a really great chart. So in this chart, we see that 88% of managers say that a critical part of their job is to make developers' technical work and effort visible, which is a lot, right? 88%. What's interesting, though, is that when we survey a sample of over 1,200 developers, only 24% of them said that their managers actually had that visibility, right? So we're looking at 88% versus 24%, which is a pretty big difference.
Right. And so like, why does that matter? Like, as you guys are thinking about this as researchers?
Yeah, it's interesting because, despite managers saying, hey, this is a really important piece of my job is to make folks' good work visible, the data itself actually shows that we're failing to make that happen. And that's actually a pretty big problem, right? Because in our research, we see that when folks feel like their work is seen, recognized, and valued, that is, it's visible, this actually directly increases their sense of thriving. So in other words, when folks feel like their work is visible, they experience greater agency, where they feel like they actually have a voice in how their work is measured. They also experience learning cultures where they feel like the entire learning process is celebrated, right? Including the process of making mistakes. They also experience greater support and belonging, where they feel like they're accepted for who they are and supported to grow as developers. And then finally, they also experience greater self-efficacy and motivation, where they're pretty sure that they can manage any problems that come up with their code.
So we've kind of laid the groundwork here, like visibility matters. And I think everyone who's listening on this kind of like, naturally understands that it's kind of cool to see the actual objective data on it, but like, hey, like this makes sense. I think the next kind of key step for us is like, okay, well, that's great. What do we do about it?
I think there's often this question of, okay, well, how do we make things visible, right? And so I actually want to answer this first by giving a little reflection on something I see as a clinical psychologist in this field. So oftentimes we, in the software world, talk about needing to fix or improve team health, as we say, right? And this visibility is a part of this team health. So I think what happens is that oftentimes folks will try to, improve team health by throwing whatever strategy they can at it. They're just kind of like, let's just throw all the good things at it and great, we've done the thing, right? And you will see this kind of like desperate cadence to this where folks get more and more reactive and then they start throwing out more and more strategies and they're not even really sure if they're working and they're just kind of like falling down this hole, right? So in the clinical world, we do have a term for this. We call this taking the kitchen sink approach, where you are throwing everything but the kitchen sink, okay? We explicitly teach people to not do this, right? Because this is bad clinical care. This is actually a really inefficient and ineffective way of addressing a problem. And oftentimes you see that the biggest reason why this happens is that the person has failed to adequately assess the problem itself. They're not adequately keeping in mind or tracking what is happening to begin with. You can't come up with a solution if you don't even know what the problem is, right? So kind of similarly in that vein, one really high impact way to increase visibility is to use metrics, but in a healthy way, right? And by healthy, I mean that you are tracking performance in a team-driven way, and you're really using metrics that fit for your team's context.
When you say like healthy metrics and ones that are specific for you, like what have you seen in the wild? Like what are some examples of things that have risen to like the top of, hey, this is actually working for us?
Yeah, I think it really, again, depends on what the team is looking for. Sometimes teams are looking to increase collaboration on their teams. And in those cases, maybe you want to start looking at things like how often or how quickly folks are reviewing pull requests, right? Other times, folks might be saying that their teams just don't get enough coding time. They're bogged down by meetings all the time. So in that case, maybe you want to look at the number of coding days your teams are able to take on.
Which is great. So great couple examples. But again, going back to the kitchen sink, it's not 25 different things.
Right.
Not only if in the sphere of kind of like, developer health and team culture, but then even within metrics, we don't want to throw the kitchen sink, once we get into that subject too. So it's like one or two, like how do we actually like, to your point, fit for purpose? Like what are the right things that matter to this team at this point?
Yeah, I like kind of describe it as like, it would be like if you went to the doctor and they were like, I'm going to take every test possible. You're also going to do an MRI. You're going to do a CT scan. You're going to get a sonogram. And you're like, why? Right? It doesn't make sense to do every single thing at once. It makes sense to figure out what the problem is first or what you're trying to change and then move from there.
Yeah, I love that. Like one of the things I think from your study that was really impactful for me, that surprised me at least, was you went and said, hey, and you can correct me where I'm wrong here, but like essentially, like 87% of developers said, I agree that healthy metrics are a positive impact on the way that I work. And you can correct me if I'm erring on the actual vernacular there, but like that surprised me. So first off, what was the actual like metric? And like, let's talk a little more about that.
Yeah, so the idea was that 87% of our sample agreed that healthy metrics use is a great way to improve visibility. Anytime we talk about the statistic, folks are like, what? No, that's too much. That's so surprising, right? And I think that it's because folks often have some fear around metrics use. But actually, as a clinical psychologist, this makes perfect sense to me. I saw this number and I was just not surprised at all, like in any way. So just to kind of explain that rationale a little bit, there is just so much research in the behavioral sciences, in the clinical sciences, in healthcare, showing that tracking helps. And tracking helps us for several reasons. So first of all, tracking helps give us concrete evidence of our own work. It turns out that humans are just really, really, really bad at knowing what we've done each day. So for example, you might have had this experience where you sit down at the end of the day and someone's like, how was your day? And you're like, I'm really tired. They're like, what'd you do? And you're like, I don't know. I have no idea what I did today. All I know is that I'm really tired, right? This is a pretty common experience. We just really suck at knowing what we've done every day. And so what happens is that when we don't know what we've done each day, we have a tendency to devalue or minimize our work. So we might say things like, I guess I just didn't do a lot. I don't know. I'm just tired for no reason. When in reality, maybe you were doing a ton of complex work all day. You had a ton of focus time. You were thinking really hard. Of course you're tired, right? And so having that kind of data is really helpful because it keeps us from devaluing or minimizing our work. We now have concrete evidence saying, hey, this is what you did today. This is what you did this week, this month, this quarter. No wonder you're tired. So what's really helpful is that now you can take that data saying, after 3 weeks of complex work, I hit burnout, right? You can use that as a point of intervention for future work. So maybe next time after 2 weeks of complex work, you can say, hey, last time when I hit week 3, things got pretty intense and I hit burnout. I don't want that to happen because we all know it's really hard to come back from burnout. So since we're only at week 2, let's go ahead and take on some less complex work, give my brain a break, right? And that kind of helps things stay more sustainable in the long term.
I love that's a great example of taking data because we're always thinking about like looking back. And you have to think about, hey, here's this thing that's happened, once or twice or maybe more times. Let's use that to go and change how we look at work going forward. And that's what really makes the impact, I think. So not only is it visibility, but it's actually improving the way that you're doing work, which is beyond just the benefits of visibility, which is great. I love that.
It actually also improves your thriving as well, because now you're creating agency, because now you feel like you have a say in what your work day looks like, right? So it kind of has this bonus effect of also improving thriving.
Yeah. Okay. So we're getting to a whole other component of that thriving framework. So it's like spilling over and in goodness, which is great. So developers, don't think managers have the right visibility, but also agree that healthy metrics can help. Like, where are we at? What is the state of the world right now when it comes to this?
Yeah. So our data shows that actually only 14% of developers said that they were using metrics in a healthy way. I personally call this an oh shit statistic because it kind of makes you go, oh shit, there's a problem here, right? So only 14%, which is not a lot at all. So when we dig a little bit deeper, we also see that only 27% of developers actually say they're using the right metrics for them, right? Really pointing to this idea that there is this misalignment on how developers think that they want to be measured or think they should be measured versus how they're actually being measured.
So now that we know this, we're not quite there. Only 14%, of developers agreed that we were using it in a healthy way. How is it that we do? How do we start? I'm an engineering manager. I'm an engineering leader. What do I do first?
Yeah, so you can actually use this acronym that I made, that is TRACE. It stands for the fact that healthy metrics are transparent, it rewards growth, gives folks agency, is consistent, and then finally explores context.
I think I love this because I think we've talked about almost every single one of these things kind of throughout our conversations in transformation. And it's because we're now like kind of giving it like a kind of a cool way to actually remember all those things, which is great. So let's dive into that. The first one is transparency. Tell us a little more about this one.
I actually want to start this one with a fun statistic. So we saw that 26% of our developers said that they weren't sure if their teams were even using metrics, which is just kind of wild, right? At a minimum, your developers should know if you're using metrics. So that's kind of one big step towards transparency. They should also know when metrics are being used and where they're being used, right? Don't keep this a secret. Don't pretend that you're not using metrics, but actually be using them. Don't keep it a secret about when metrics matter versus when they don't. Right? You want to make sure that you're nice and transparent with your developers on exactly how, when, why, and which metrics are being used.
I love that. And the second one is growth. Tell me more about growth.
Yeah. So for this one, we actually have a pretty cool quote from an IC developer during one of our qualitative interviews. And the quote says, "I don't review PRs fast enough. And I know that's my problem." And he, their manager, is like, "Yeah, I see that you're stuck in this area. Are there any blockers here, right? Is there any way that we can improve on this?" And so we created an initial goal around it. Try to do at least one PR review within 24 hours. So what I really love about this quote is that you see that the manager is using data to identify blockers, right? They're identifying the fact that this person is not very fast at reviewing PRs, okay? From this, they create a learning goal, the goal being trying to do at least one PR review within 24 hours. What's really awesome about this goal is that the goal is specific and realistic. Because it's realistic, it's actually achievable, right? You've probably made the mistake of having goals like, be better at this, or I'm going to be faster. And it kind of begs this question of what does better mean? What does faster mean? How do you know if you got better? How do you know if you got faster? We don't want to operate on vibes here, right? Because vibes are pretty biased. We want to operate on data. And so here we see that the goal is nice and specific. They're saying, okay, we know that you have gotten better at this because you've done one PR review within 24 hours, right? That's really nice and measurable. What's also great is that the goal celebrates growth and change over time. You see here in this bolded section at the bottom, it's an initial goal. They're not saying, yeah, you just need to do one within 24 hours and boom, best developer in the world. Yeah, that's all it takes, turns out, right? They're saying, hey, this is the initial goal. We're going to build up to it. We're going to move towards it slowly because nobody can become the fastest reviewer overnight, right? We're going to kind of build this in slowly, which is also just a nice reminder that change is slow and non-linear. So this person might knock out 2 within 24 hours this week, but then you know what? Next time they might do none within 24 hours. And that's okay, right? Change goes up and down. It's slow. It's a process. And they're understanding that in this kind of quote here.
No, I love that because when I first read nonlinear, I just thought you were talking about an exponential curve, and I was like, that sounds really ambitious. So nice to know that it's up and down, and that's generally we're looking at the overall trend, not the onesies and twosies, as we get throughout our day and our weeks.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so next one, so we've done transparency, growth. Next one is agency, right?
So we have this other quote here from a different IC who says, sometimes they, the manager, had a suggestion for a metric that I might work on, and sometimes I agree with that suggestion. And other times I say, well, these are the reasons why I think it'd be difficult to focus on that metric right now. How about this metric instead? And then we have a negotiation with them about it. Okay. So you see here that the manager avoids shadow measurement. They instead allow the developer to have a voice in how they're being measured, right? They're not keeping it a secret. They're letting the developer know, this is what I'm going to be measuring or looking at right now. Do you agree with this, right? The developer then can kind of give their opinion about this and use the metric to advocate for themselves, right? I think what's really important here is that they're asking developers for their opinions. Oftentimes what happens with managers is that they feel like, if they don't have all the answers right now, if they don't, if they're not able to somehow read their developers' minds, that somehow makes them a bad manager, right? And that's not true. Asking for opinions doesn't make you a bad manager. It actually makes you a really, really good manager who's giving your developers agency. And I think that's just a really big misconception that happens.
Yeah, I think that's something that you have to kind of soak in a little bit. Like, that's okay. It's okay not to have all the answers. It's okay to adjust. It's okay to be flexible. That doesn't mean that you're something that's just constantly waffling. It's actually good to continue to receive inputs, in perpetuity.
I think also just to kind of add to that, right? It's not just okay to not know the answers. It's that you shouldn't know all the answers. You shouldn't be able to, there would be something very wrong if you could just read your developers' minds all the time. That's something wrong there, right? Like, there's a weird boundary being crossed. So like you actually want to be able to ask people for input and get their opinions.
And I think that's what's really cool here is going back to the comment you made kind of earlier in this talk, is it's not just, agency around healthy metrics per se, but it's agency around what do we do with this information? What do we do now that we have this information? Like, how are we going to change? What should we work on as a team? And that's coming from the ground up versus mandates, which goes back to what David was saying in our first episode, which I love this.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think actually speaking of another thing that kind of David was talking about, one of his big themes was it was all about having stable, like long running teams. And it was kind of like getting after this like theme of consistency, which you actually have also in this framework, which is really cool. So let's dive into that as well, which I think is really important for managers to kind of like understand and like, how do I actually incorporate this into the way I work with my teams week by week?
Yeah. So the C here stands for be consistent. And by consistent, we mean being consistent across time, teams, and individuals on when you're using metrics, whether you're using metrics, how much metrics matter, and how you're applying metrics, right? And so we see here in this graph right here that the majority of folks report using metrics during kind of these planning phases, things like sprint planning, stand-ups, but less so during kind of the more reflective or evaluative phases like monthly or quarterly business reviews, right? And that's actually a mistake. You want to be using metrics pretty consistently throughout the life cycle so that you actually know how things have panned out over time, right? If you're only looking at metrics to plan for things, but you're never following up to see how those things ended up, now you have an incomplete picture. Like I said earlier, you also want to be using them pretty consistently across teams. So you don't want to say, hey, I really like Joe over here. And so I'm just not going to look at Joe's metrics. I'm just going to believe whatever Joe is telling me because we've got good vibes. But I don't know much about this other person, so I'm going to look at their metrics, right? We know that our vibes, our sense of what's happening by ourselves, that we're pretty biased people. And that's not, a criticism on any manager. That's just human nature. We're pretty biased, okay? And so you want to be using metrics pretty consistently across people, regardless of what you're picking up on vibes-wise.
Actually, I love that point specifically on vibes, because that's actually something that, having worked on the Flow product for 5 years now, that's something we pick up pretty consistently. Like, we've found that generally speaking, like, not always true, but oftentimes you're going to have a number of quiet engineers, and they are typically really like impactful on the team. They're contributing a lot. They're pushing everything forward. But the problem is they don't speak up. And so sometimes we look at the people who are speaking up. Oh, I know what they're doing because they're like they are active in the conversation in a meeting, or you kind of know what they're doing. And that's not a fair way. It's a very biased way, actually, of looking at a team, because you're basing it on vibes, which is not reality often.
Yes, we want to be looking at reality and facts, not vibes, folks.
As much as I love vibes. So
yeah, vibes are great. Vibes are great for friendships, relationships, whatever, right? But when it comes to measuring success, you really want to be relying on data.
Okay, so last up is explore. Again, another theme that has been pretty central to our conversations so far.
The E in phrase stands for explore context, right? I really love this quote here from an IC who says, a good manager is going to be hands-on, but also have context. For example, your metrics might look really bad, but your manager is going to know that it's because you've been researching something for a week and a half that doesn't involve committing or reviewing code, right? We all know this. Context matters. And so, I really want to highlight that metrics are the start of a conversation. They're not the end of a conversation. They're not the only conversation. Use metrics as a starting point, right? And this is actually true of all data. So for example, I give a lot of health examples because of my background, so apologies. But when you go to the doctor's office, your doctor doesn't just like take your vitals and say, hey, your blood pressure is really high. Oh, well. And then, like, that's the end of it, right? They're not just like, sucks, see ya, right? You have a conversation with you about it. They ask you, well, what do you think is going on? Maybe you're feeling really anxious that day and you're like, things are going well, but I'm just feeling really anxious right now. And so my blood pressure's elevated. Or maybe you're like, I feel fine. So maybe there is something going on with my blood pressure, right? Context really matters. And so similarly, with software metrics, don't just say, hey, I'm noticing something is different. Oh, well, right? Or don't say, hey, something's different. I hate this by, right? Use this as an opportunity to say, hey, something's different. What do you think is going on here? Why do you think this is different? What do you think we can do about it moving forward? Is it something worth paying attention to? Or, is this just kind of a fluke? Have a conversation about it. Because again, context really matters.
So oftentimes we get in the frame of thinking about, the engineer to manager relationship. Let's light it up a little bit. Let's think of like, I am a VP of engineering. I have multiple teams reporting to me. And I see something that's off in the data. Like, what would you recommend for me as someone who may not have all that context because I'm not working with a team day by day to like start to, explore what's going on?
I mean, it sounds silly and easy because it is easy, but that doesn't mean it's not effective. But I would recommend you reach out to that team and say, hey, what's going on? I mean, truly, it's that simple. The person whose data that is knows best about what's going on in their context. And oftentimes, instead of, throwing yourself into a tailspin, trying to interpret data that you have no context on, or trying to read people's minds, right? Go ahead and ask the person what they think is going on.
Which I love that. And I love that for two reasons. One is it goes back to your agency, kind of point of like, we're working on this together. But also what I found is that it builds a really cool muscle memory of like, we start to look at insights, start to look at kind of like this changed, and it becomes easier and easier to like quickly understand this is what's happening. This is what we're going. This is A, something that is fine, or B, this is something that we need to go and, work on. And as we make that part of the way we work, like day in, day out, just becomes so second nature that like, it no longer takes all this effort to understand, which is like so great. We start to see teams start to grok the data this way. So I love this kind of last thing about, really building this context because it gets easier over time, which is really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kind of recap this, right? Because I know we've talked about a lot of things. We might as well just like go over it one last time. Healthy metrics follow the acronym of TRACE. That is, they're transparent about metrics use, rewards growth over time, gives folks agency by giving developers a voice, is consistent in how metrics are applied, and then finally explores context beyond the metrics.
Perfect. I love this. This has been a great conversation. I hope these 5 points can really help you understand how we actually implement healthy metrics within our team. It's not just throwing the kitchen sink, as you brought up at the very beginning of this. And we're so excited to have future conversations. So we've now had 4 episodes of Transformation. So thankful for each and every one of you for joining us. We've got 2 more coming. We're super excited about both talking about how we use metrics to optimize our workflow, as well as advocate for our teams. 2 things, as you'll see, are very connected to things we've already talked about. So with that, grateful for the time, and we will see you in 2 weeks.